With that in mind, I will waste no further time and go to our first panelist as soon as I can. I'm going to introduce each panelist, give them 3 or 4 minutes to make their first intervention, and then go on to the next panelist. After the panel discussion, I'll open up the floor for questions and answers, which will come to me through chat. But I will first go to a member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, Mr. Mehmet Gulpinar, for some short remarks. Let me also mention that the web stream, the YouTube web stream, is open and accessible. I think that should also come up in the chat as well. So I'm going to start first with Mr. Joachim Strand. I have an initial broad question, which perhaps all our panelists can address, and then we can see where the discussion takes us. What has been the most significant impact of the COVID crisis on the working of parliaments? And to what extent has COVID accelerated existing currents, or conversely, created whole new challenges and opportunities? Now, Mr. Joachim Strand is a Finnish politician, currently serving the Parliament of Finland for the Swedish People's Party of Finland, representing the Vasa constituency, excuse my pronunciation. He is the chairman of the Committee for the Future and a member of the Commerce Committee. He's also a member of Vasa City Council since 2005 and its chairman since 2012. Joachim has a long career of being part of boards of both organizations and companies, including the Regional Council of Ostrobodnia and a number of other, which I won't try and pronounce, which I won't do Euroservice or the company. So without further ado, I'll go to Mr. Joachim Strand. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the invitation. And actually, your pronunciation for Vasa was excellent. I think maybe you are living in Vasa, we just don't know it yet. But thanks for inviting me. And to your question, I would say that it's been very good for us that for many, many years, if we think about the work in Parliament, we have had all documents in a digital form. Very well developed systems for handling information. So now when we started to have also the committee meetings and hearings and other things remotely, it was quite easy to switch to that mode. Of course, there is also now things under, let's say, under construction. We have not yet been able to vote digitally in the Parliament, even though we are working very much remotely, but the system is ready and might be taken into use already next week with the budget before Christmas. So let's see. But I mean, it doesn't matter what the word looks like. It's our job to work as good as possible. The thing that is more important, I believe, is to figure out together how we could get the, let's say, get the best for Europe coming out of this pandemic, and how we could use this pandemic also to solve, now when we are talking about putting billions and billions of euros to different types of projects, how we can use this situation also to fight climate change, to develop new technologies, to make sure that coming generations will have will prosper. So that's something I also hope that we will be able to discuss today. But here are some short introduction, and happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strand. I'll now go to Stefan Marshall. Professor Dr. Stefan Marshall is chair of German politics at the Department of Social Sciences of the Heinrich Heine University of Düsseldorf and vice president for international relations and science communication. He is a specialist on the political system of Germany, on comparative as well as transnational parliamentarianism, and especially on political communication and participation. He has published popular textbooks as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters on political communication and parliamentary affairs. So over to you, Dr. Marshall.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel and this workshop. I would like to start with some general remarks on crises and the role of parliaments, if you allow. I mean, we always start saying that crises in general seem to weaken parliamentary democracy, and I guess there are good reasons to say so, because crises, they require rapid responses. There's not always time for deliberation and for lengthy parliamentary processes. So crises are in general moments where people rally around the executive flag, I would say. But crises are different. I mean, one crisis is different from the other one. So we have to differentiate a little bit, and we have to look at the specifics of a crisis and of the pandemic crisis and how that has affected. For the sake of typology, I would suppose to distinguish two types of crisis. Type 1 would be a crisis which asks for a between parties. A type 2 crisis, such as a pandemic or an earthquake or a terrorist or military attacks, they create a state of emergency. And so in this type of crisis, rapid reaction is necessary and required. But at the same time, parliaments might have problems to convene and to do so. This type of two crises, like the pandemic, they have a high potential for weakening parliaments in all its functions. So in the legislative function, oversight and communication. And so parliaments are highly vulnerable when it comes to such a crisis as the COVID-19 pandemic. What we can also, second differentiation, what we can see is that parliament
School of Transnational Governance and adjunct professor of legislative drafting in the Department of Political Sciences of LUISS University in Rome. A current research interest focus comparative and European studies related to parliamentary oversight of the executive, parliamentary participation in better regulation and impact assessment and interparliamentary cooperation. Elena Griglio is an author of over 80 essays and book chapters on issues of parliamentary democracy in the European Union, better regulation, regional federal studies, and social rights protection. So over to you, Elena Griglio.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored and glad to be part of the seminar. Well, I will start by saying that to me, COVID has been a revolution for parliaments. I think that this is undeniable evidence of parliamentary activity, and saying that parliamentary prerogatives should be respected. And the same happened in Italy, in the Italian Senate. But also I'm thinking about the organization of new special oversight activities. Oliver Rosenberg mentioned some of them. There's an interesting studies by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy.
Need to meet also in person, so that was something I wanted to comment on. And then to your question, maybe it's there's been too little time to deeply analyze, but I would say that I'm quite happy about how we have handled the situation in Finland, as I believe, and I don't feel that
kind of a seismic shift between of the power between executive and legislators. I think that happened in the first weeks. A lot of parliaments have been paralyzed in the first weeks of the pandemic, but then they started to learn. As Elena pointed out, they started to find ways to solve the crisis. And what we see now is exactly what Elena has been pointing to, is that parliaments try to prepare for the next situation, for the next crisis. And what we can see, at least I can say that for the German cases, that there are a lot of institutional learning processes now going on. I take part in a lot of expert hearings in parliaments where it's about changing constitutions, where it's about changing the rules of procedures in order to be prepared for the next time. So what I would say, yes, there's a lot of institutional learning that will prevent, I guess what you mentioned, this seismic shift of power between executive and legislatures.
Concentration of the executive power, what the political scientists call the presidentialization of democracies, as true it can be with prime minister, but as well a development of parliamentary oversight for the last decade, and third, a kind of individualization of parliamentary representation with a more limited influence of political parties and a more individual relations between MPs and voters with a kind of entrepreneurship representation. And if you take those three trends, well, in a way, the COVID has strengthened them, has accelerated them without changing dramatically. Rearrangements, special procedures linked to this crisis. In French, we call them the concours des pouvoirs. In English, it will be a kind of special collaboration of powers. Take, for instance, the entering into war of a given country, well, it's not as there should be a surprise, as there is an emergency. Usually, it's not the traditional way of doing parliamentary politics. And in many countries, there is first a military intervention and then a parliamentary debate. And possibly then after, a few months after, a formal parliamentary vote. So it's a kind of possibility of adapting the usual relation between both power because of the very specificity of an emergency case. And what we see in a way for the COVID is the same story, which means that the arrangements are in a way temporary and are not will not last ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosenberg. It reminds me of, when we're talking about the impact of these things, and often it's too soon to tell. It reminds me of that comment about the French Revolution. What do you think the repercussions have been? And the answer being, it's too soon to tell. Thank you very much. And I see reference also to this presidentialization again, which has been happening for probably decades now. I'm turning to Joe Sternberg.
Yeah, so I guess, look, if the question is there some kind of major shift underway in terms of the relationship between executives and legislatures? My sense is yes, as a matter of necessity. And again, as a journalist looking on this process from the outside, I see a couple reasons for that. One is the crisis is so complicated. I think it is defying the ability of any executive, whether that's a president in some systems or a prime minister in the inner circle of their cabinet in other systems. I mean, the crisis is just too complicated, from a policy and a political perspective for a small group of people to really manage it. And so, of necessity, you start seeing them going to parliaments looking for some kind of guidance about what sort of balance between all of these competing interests voters will find acceptable. I think that's been particularly noticeable here in the UK, where a series of parliamentary revolts against various of Boris Johnson's attempts to address aspects of the coronavirus crisis, I think, are becoming a blessing in disguise for Johnson, because that is sending him a signal he wouldn't get any other way about where the voters seem to be on a lot of these difficult questions. And for the same reason, I think that lawmakers are sensing an opportunity to assert themselves, because I think that they might often sense that the executive doesn't completely have a firm grasp on the situation. And so this is an opportunity for those lawmakers to step in and do right by their constituents by representing the interests of those constituents into the government. And I think that those are very healthy trends. So, I mean, I think that it's good for us to go back to an environment where the parliament serves its function of giving voice to the electorate on a lot of these really complicated issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sternberg. I'm tempted to come in on Brexit, but as a British person working for the European Commission, I don't think I will at this time. I'll go straight to Ms. Elena Griglio. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, on the executive legislative relationship, I believe that the pandemic has emphasized and accelerated some processes in the rebalancing of the executive legislative relations, which were already underway, and that in this sense there's more continuity there, discontinuity. But if I had to use a traditional distinction between legislators as lawmaking bodies and parliaments, I would say that representative assemblies, at least in Europe, where we have parliamentary forms of government, worked more as parliaments than as legislators in the COVID emergency. I would say more in terms of debate, fact-finding, visibility for all parties involved, and less in terms of decision makers, which means that the main change is the shift from the legislative activity to the non-legislative activity. because parliaments have undoubtedly been sidelined in the adoption of the fundamental anti-COVID measures, not just of legislative decision, but also of secondary legislation. And yet they have tried to compensate this loss of power to the oversight function, which enables them to influence the action of the executive, both ex ante, therefore before the government takes a decisions, which is what in Italy we call the indirizzo politico, which means setting the political direction, and at the same time also overseeing the executive ex post, which means after a certain decision has been taken, to ask the government to give count of its behavior. And so parliaments have lost hard power to make decisions, but probably they have compensated this loss of hard power to their soft power, which means trying to influence government behaviors, which is hard to of course, to implement, because it involves many soft skills, I would say, of parliament, including the relationship with the media, how media can support parliamentary activity in addressing government action towards a certain goal. But I think that in a normative perspective, this is a desirable outcome. Because I don't think that parliaments could ever act as first responders of a crisis, of an emergency, because they are complex organizations. They involve a large number of MPs. They have well-codified procedures. They have certain rigidities. They have to grant full transparencies. And these rigidities are at the same time the guarantees of parliamentary activity. Therefore, if we want to respect the very basic identity of representative democracy, we must accept that parliaments are not first responders in the crisis. And yet, they can compensate a certain loss of democratic control by reinforcing the scrutiny oversight function in the regards of the executive. And that's what, in my view, they have tried to do.
Thank you very much, Ms. Griglio. That's fascinating, and I very much appreciate that description you give there of losing their decision-making power, but maybe adapting to be something more of a soft power, influencing the debate in other ways, and often depending on their relationship with media, with civil society, and with ordinary people, which in the end is who they represent. We're coming up to time when I'm going to go to the Q&A session, but I did have a question which I would like to turn to Mr. Strand first, and then maybe the others as well. Well, it relates to the issue of the long-term impact of COVID. We know the impact is already profound. Societal cohesion is likely to suffer, I imagine, and trust in institutions potentially worsen. Maybe Parliament can come out well out of this. How can parliaments adapt to work in an environment that could become ever more fractured, polarized, and even, dare I say, unstable? And Mr. Strand, it would be useful to hear your the long-term analysis that has been done by the Finnish Futures Committee, maybe in relation to this question. So over to you, Mr. Strand, first.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the other panelists. It's very interesting to listen to you, because I get a lot of things are coming back to me from the very exceptional spring we've had both on the national level, and decisions been made on the local level. And coming back to your question, I think that the most important thing is that we make sure that we have the ordinary people with us, that they understand where the world is going and what we are doing. And from the Committee of the Future, we heard more than 100 experts already during spring, during summer, during the beginning of autumn, and we have more than 300 pages on what will change and all things related to technology and other things. But if we think about things that will not change, it's the values of ordinary people, and a lot of things that has to do with humanity. And relating this to your previous question about the executive and legislative power, and taking in also the people as the third element, when I think about the spring and the first wave of COVID, I'm very happy that it was not the politicians who was always on the front row, because it has to do with medical issues that we had the executive power. But something that differs from now, half a year later, is that when I look at my own email or or phone, I don't get. During spring, I got lots of feedback from ordinary people. We have 5.5 million people in Finland, and I felt that we have also 5.5 million COVID experts in Finland. Everyone was an expert. Should we close the schools? Should we not close the school? But now, during this autumn, somehow they have learned to or feel that maybe we trust our government, and in Finland so far it's been going quite well also with the virus and with the economy, even though we are of course all dependent on each other, and we had some COVID cases also in the parliament this week. But maybe my main point is that we need to make sure that we have the people with us in everything we do, and that they understand why we are doing what we are doing, when we are closing schools, when we are opening schools, and all this, because the people's values and being a human being will not change, even though we have 300 pages of interesting technology findings that I would be happy to share maybe another time with you.
Thomas, can I say something on your question?
Yes, go ahead.
It's more so your question were about the long-term consequences. It's more a doubt than an answer. I'm sorry for that. It is the money issue, because with the COVID crisis, we have seen a lot of public money being spent for good reason, because of the economic crisis following the lockdowns. Also, this is linked to the recent development of the European Union with the so-called new generation EU bonds. And to me, this is a challenge for parliaments, because there used to be a clear division of tasks within legislators, with very often the conservative willing to control public deficits, the traditional power of the purse, being sure that the money was well spent, etc. And with, probably on the left, some politicians calling for more generosity. And maybe it will not last, but for now this is a bit lost, because governments are spending a lot. My President Macron saying we should face this crisis whatever it costs, and he keeps repeating that. And so this traditional, not only political game, but role for the parliament to control public spending, to be sure that public money is well spent, is well, not lost, but as lost is a traditional way of doing it. And probably there will be new practices in the future. We know, for instance, that the European Parliament will have a special role to give an agreement to the new generation bonds. So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the issue of money being spent is an important one. With the centralisation of power and the fact that more money is being spent more quickly and in many countries with less oversight is certainly an issue of concern. So I'm going to park this question, if you don't mind, for now. I hope we can come back to it. I should be going to the Q&A now. But first, I would just like to say that it's an honour for us to welcome Mr. Mehmet Kasim Gulpinar, member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, who's going to make short remarks for 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll go to other questions. Over to you, Mr. Gulpinar. Mr. Gulpinar, we don't have your mic and video on at the moment. Please check that they're on.
Şu an duyuyorlar. Sesin gitti.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon, all. Okay, thanks. As you all know, the COVID pandemic has caused a significant disruption and hardship in nearly every aspect of our lives. And although we have seen great news on a vaccine and in the effective treatment of patients, our lives is still far from back to normal. As a matter of fact, in approximately in our parliament, 125 member of parliaments has been infected in Turkey. And seizing upon this opportunity, I wish all patients a speedy recovery. But the causes of and solutions to the current pandemic are transnational. It is important for countries and the parliaments to learn from each other how they are dealing with the crisis and put together lessons learned for future planning. Greater. Okay. Okay, and with the crisis and put together lessons learned for future planning. Greater cooperation will enable us to share knowledge and develop and apply effective solutions. And the Turkish Parliament took some administrative and legislative steps in order to continue functioning effectively and alleviate economic and social problems caused by the pandemic. Crisis Management Center has been established within the Grand National Assembly of Turkey in early March. Contact desk has been established, which is composed of the Ministry of Health and National Assembly bureaucrats. This year is the centenary of the reopening of the National Assembly, and the 100th anniversary activities, which was planned before, have been postponed to a later date within the scope of the measures taken against COVID. And the Turkish Parliament suspended plenary and committee sessions after passing emergency legislation. General Assembly and committee works was suspended for 48 days in April and May. And the innovative solutions emerged elsewhere to keep plenary and committees functioning, such as the use of remote meeting technologies. But legal restrictions on virtual parliamentary session and voting exist in Turkey. The rules of procedure of our parliament does not allow the plenary and the committees to debate and vote remotely. And Turkish legislation requires personal presence at parliamentary sessions. However, within the ongoing pandemic, some informative committee meetings were held where there was no voting and some members participate remotely. And what this pandemic has highlighted is that effective parliamentary engagement in governance during crisis is not only essential for preserving democratic practices and institutions, but is also necessary to ensure the best possible outcome, where parliaments have ensured that citizen needs and concerns are taken into consideration. Citizen compliance with necessary measures is secured willingly. The pandemic has already changed our world decisively and forced upon the world a transformation. The parliaments will keep pace with this process. And in the future, it seems more likely that more and more parliaments will establish necessary legal and technical basis in order to the plenary and committees to hold remote sittings. They will be able to debate and vote remotely, I think. And authentication of votes is of crucial importance to this end. Looking ahead, it will be important to ensure that legislations permit parliamentary business to be carried out virtually with a clear regulatory framework and adequate security measures to ensure the integrity of the process. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, Mr. Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gulpinar, for coming in and joining us and for keeping your comments on message and succinct. We do appreciate that. We are in the Q&A session now. we have one or two questions which have come through. We have an existing question which some of our panelists haven't come back on yet. I will say that an issue on technology might be worth broaching here. We've discussed it to some degree already, and the question being about the fact that we have the rapid evolution of technology being used by parliaments, and the fact that COVID has made this a necessity in many ways. Prompts a question from the Q&A from our chat line. What are the actual real working practices within parliaments that can really benefit from the use of this technology? And a related question which comes, which I have to say I hadn't considered immediately, was that the technology behind this. Where does this technology come from? Who owns this technology? And how do we protect the data, for example, that is being used to drive it? And the obviously issues of privacy, issues of fundamental human rights at basis as well. I'll leave that open to who would like to answer those related digital questions first, or if you'd like to come back on anything that Mr. Gulpana has said. Someone who hasn't spoken most recently.
I can try to go back on the issue of digitalizations, because I think that procedural and technological innovations are really an opportunity for Parliament, and this is an evidence. They can enhance the toolkit available to representative assemblies to perform their fundamental functions. They can structure a stronger interaction with citizens. So, I mean, and I think that they could well be applied to many of the basic fact-finding, evidence-seeking activities, hearings, and so forth. But I think that digital innovation is not neutral on procedures. I mean, that we should seriously consider the effect and very fundamental values that parliamentary procedures protect, which is the balance between majority and oppositions, which is transparency, which is pluralism, which is the respect of every single stage of the procedures. Because there are, I mean, scholars, but also political debate, issues of security, reliability, privacy, and transparency have been raised in the use of digital tools. And at the same time, there's a problem related to the capacity of Parliament to hack the places of negotiations, because negotiations take place not just in formal meetings, but also in informal meetings. And I say this being Italian, I mean, a negotiation in Italy usually happens at a table, seated at a table behind a good dish of pasta. So, I mean, this is our traditional way of doing it, and I would really try to safeguard this. But as Stefan was saying, I mean, we probably will need to combine digital arrangements and the respect of our traditional way of performing our functions. So I think that digitalizations goes beyond merely providing virtual platforms where to meet here or even voting. I think it's we need to accompany parliaments in the attempt to innovate their modus operandi, trying to, as I was mentioning, to also think that there are some procedures which probably won't be turned to digital, and I'm specifically thinking of the way the legislative procedures works in the Italian Parliament, when we usually have thousands of amendments. Now we have 3 Greek laws in the Senate, which are scrutinized at the same time. We have something like 5,000 amendments to examine and to vote. How can you apply electronic voting to such an amount of amending proposals? So, I mean, it really depends from one procedure on the other, and we really should carefully consider the values to protect.
If I may add some remarks to that. Yes, I mean, when we talk about digitization, it's nothing which started to happen this year. I mean, back in the 1970s, parliaments started to get to digitalize their documents, etc. Then we had like internet parliaments going online, etc. We have social media since well already for decades. So it's nothing which was discovered this year. So when we talk about digitization, then we talk about the acceleration of a trend which has already happened way before, and it's nothing new in this year. And what we can see when we talk about how parliaments adopt digitization, it's not only the parliaments as institutions or as organizations adopt that, but it's the parliamentarians themselves, the individuals, which start to use digital tools, especially in the field of social media. You see a lot of parliamentarians, especially young parliamentarians, which create kind of a new way to communicate and which import this way to communicate also into the parliamentary bodies. So that's something which is already happening. It's nothing you can prevent. The point is how can you manage that in a way? And indeed, I mean, there are some very tricky issues which have been raised and in this context, which is the data issue, data protection issue, which is something especially in Germany, we're very concerned about. Then we have other issues, documentation, who rules about the servers, are the systems stable if you go to remote voting, etc. Can they not be hacked in whatever way? So then you get into these technical issues. But I think these are technical issues which have to be attacked or addressed now, to be solved now. But still, I think that's kind of a development which is going to happen. And I think it has been accelerated by COVID, and especially it has been accelerated because a lot of people are now also used to use much more digital tools than before. When we talk about citizens, when we talk about experts, etc., a lot of things, a lot of communication has become more and more digitalized. And if parliaments want to keep up with these tendencies, with these trends, and one still wants to be connected to experts, to people, then of course they have to engage in that much more. And then it's not only about communication, the communication function of parliaments, it's about also of the control, the oversight function, which can also profit from that. And also finally legislation. I think when it comes to connecting to people and to try to find ways to get their input online. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Marshall and Mr. Griglio. I think you're absolutely right. And of course, the digitalization, if you like, is not a new thing. That's been going underway for decades. I think what's happened, though, we've had a mushrooming of it. We've had the pace, the power of the digital technologies, and the fact that you can have mass data, but at the same time, micro-targeting, if you like. And they can use that power to reach inside the brains of individual people, almost. And I think that the combining the kind of the physicality, physical meetings where we can, and face-to-face meetings with the new opportunities that these virtual technologies give us will be very important. And it could possibly give us new ways to connect, especially with younger parliamentarians who are much more familiar maybe with social media and so on. And absolutely on the issue of oversight, I think that's incredibly important. The devolving of power, of oversight power that comes down to individual citizens that digital technology can provide. Mr. Sternberg, we haven't come to you for a while. Would you like to comment on this issue or a previous issue?
Well, one thing I'd like to say, which I think kind of feeds into this technology issue insofar as, the message that we've gotten from both of the lawmakers on the panel is the importance of in-person meeting and the fact that there are costs associated with relying on the technology in addition to the benefits that come from using the technology. And so that means that a decision is going to have to be made at some point after the pandemic about, where will you draw the balance between returning to a pre-coronavirus degree of in-person lawmaking versus, continuing to use some of these technologies. And that feeds into what I think is actually one of the big and important points here that we almost never talk about, and that is what defines an emergency. So we've been talking, a couple of my fellow panelists have mentioned the fact that early in the emergency phase of this, it was natural for the executive to take on more power. The longer this goes on, that naturally feeds into the legislature. But you actually have to make a decision about at what point does an emergency just become a new fact of life, and you have to come up with some kind of quasi-permanent way of dealing with that. And so, I mean, the interesting question here, and I think I've got some perspective on this as an American, because we have been arguing in the United States going back to the 18th century about what the relationship between executive and legislative power should be, particularly in an emergency context. But we've also been litigating for almost as long what actually constitutes an emergency. And you see that happening right now is a lot of state legislatures and the Congress are saying to governors or the president, well, hang on, this has been happening for 9 months. It's not a crisis anymore. We need to start reintroducing more lawmaking, more legislative activity into this process. You can't govern with an executive in crisis mode forever. And so I would just hope that, moving forward, maybe prompted by this question of what should be the new normal in terms of legislative working procedures, but also sort of driving this question of what's the relationship between the executive and the legislature. This is a new opportunity for us to think about how are legislatures going to define the emergencies, or how are they going to set parameters in the future for what are the emergency conditions where the legislature might be willing to cede some of its authority temporarily to an executive. But then do legislatures learn from this experience that they also need to be more thoughtful about defining the parameters for when they will start taking some of that authority back?
Yes, absolutely. I think of an important issue there, and it's something that we've looked into quite seriously. The fact that the use of emergency powers, the implementation of emergency powers can be justified initially, but it's not a binary question. It's a question of how long that justification lasts. With the International IDEA, we've set up a global monitor to look at exactly that, the democracy and human rights implications or impacts of the different pieces of legislation and activity by governments all across the world. And obviously the seriousness of that and the way that we should respond depends upon how long that goes on for, and what we deem as indeed being a crisis. The balance has to change. The question is, as you say, at what point do we adapt to this new normal, and what do we regard as being an appropriate new normal? Would other panelists like to come in on this issue, looking again maybe at the long-term impact of the crisis and how this could change the societies we live in and Parliament's role within that society?
Yes, if I may. On this issue as well, on digitalization, I hear the reasons for being concerned about the effect of digitalization. I hear that meeting through Zoom is not through parliamentarism, that informal contacts and direct contacts are needed for parliamentary influence, and etc. But the point I'd like to make, and having in mind your long-term question, is that I think we can't afford to be conservative only regarding parliaments nowadays, for a very precise reason, which is the fact that parliaments are rejected by public opinion, like it or not. There are countries in Europe where parliaments are trusted by 1 citizen out of 10 only. So something has to be done. I'm not calling for changing everything, but new venues for organizing legislators has to be considered seriously through the departure from the traditional parliamentary textbook. And I see 2 opportunities in digitalization. Again, there are threats. One is for the connection with citizens, with NGOs, with what you discussed in your last conference 2 days ago, all kind of public engagement of parliaments. When you don't have a physical place to talk, it's easier to break the monopoly of parliaments and of MPs on talks. And actually that's what we are doing now with academics and MPs discussing together. And I guess it's easier to do it through internet than within the building of the parliament. The other point is also important. It has to do with multi-level parliamentarism, so the connection between representative assemblies at the subnational, national, and EU level for the European Union. Well, electronic devices offer an opportunity at a lower cost to meet without giving too much power to the European Parliament as the organizer of the physical meeting, which has its importance for national parliamentarians, and probably in the very near future to have automatic translation of the speeches of the MPs and the possibility to discuss in your language and to be quickly understood. Maybe I'm optimistic, but we see that technologies are progressing very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important points, I think, on the representation. Sorry, go ahead.
So no, perhaps if I may, just concerning the question of the long-lasting problems or challenges for Parliament. First up, I found it rather interesting that for the first time in the last years, during the crisis in Germany, trust in government was higher than trust in Parliament. So that was something which was very special. I mean, normally we have very stable gap between trust in Parliament and government, always in favor of Parliament, and now it changed in the crisis, and that's something I found interesting. Now, my point is, I guess, is that now Parliament has to find its role in the aftermath of the first wave or second wave of the crisis, and that's something very challenging in some ways, because now it's no longer the time for quick decisions, like based on expert opinions or whatever what happened in the first phase, but now it's about distribution, redistribution of money. It's about budget, it's about the problems which are caused by the crisis. And now the question is not only a question for parliaments, also but for the party systems. Are the party systems able to mobilize and to organize those who might be victims of the crisis? And there will be a lot of victims in terms of economic terms, etc., and social terms. So we will have a lot of social and economic challenges. And the question for me is especially whether parliaments will be able to represent these groups, these issues and these points, and will be able to discuss it and to find decisions which are then accepted by societies, because societies will be different in 1 year than they were 1 year ago. And a lot of children much more pluralistic, with much more cleavages, with much more problems and so conflicts within societies, and it will be very challenging for parliaments really to bridge the gaps, to find solutions, to come to points and to come to whatever kind of solutions which are then accepted or tolerated by societies.
Yeah, Professor Marshall, absolutely. And what you commented on there was something I was going to raise myself. I mean, it was mentioned just before, the issue of trust, the fact that for many people in society, particularly with the COVID crisis, they may be a feeling that they're not being properly protected. And when you add this to the impact of globalization, maybe the rising in inequality and weakening of opportunity, and maybe rising injustice in some parts of the world, maybe you have a sort of temporary switch and confidence in executive to get you out of the hole, but in the end, there's a lowering, a weakness in trust by the whole community in the institutions of government, institutions of democracy. And unless you get a handle on that and can respond to people's needs effectively, then you're in big trouble in the medium to long term. And that's where we see people looking to other kinds of institution and other kinds of easy answers, which we all know about.
Can I?
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Can I come back on the latest discussion on strengthening connection with citizens and trust? I fully agree with Olivier. I mean, the digital tools are really a valuable instrument for strengthening Parliament's connection with citizens. But I also wonder, what do we do with this interaction? How do we channel the interaction with citizens in the standard parliamentary procedures? Because Parliament, I think that they should really learn how to translate the feedback received from citizens into their ordinary activity, into their interaction with the government. And that's probably the missing link sometimes, because many parliaments have their own procedures, their own tools of interaction with citizens, but this interaction does not bring to anything sometimes. It's just stay there. I mean, we have reports on answers from citizens, on Q&A, whatever, but then parliaments don't do anything. So I think that working on procedures, ensuring citizens that their answer is worked upon by parliaments and is transformed in the institutional decision making. For instance, would be very interesting to just give a feedback to citizens by drafting a resolution which gives counsel of the main outcomes received from stakeholders and so forth. And this happens sometimes. So again, the COVID in this field can be an opportunity of change. And we have many priority issues that really needs to be worked upon by parliaments, by working with citizens. We have already mentioned budgetary issues, but also I'm thinking about the problem of quality legislation, because one main problem that citizens deplore is the bad quality of legislation, especially secondary legislation, which is drafted by the governments in response to the emergency. At least we have this in Italy with the so-called DPCM, which are decrees of the President of the Council of Ministers, which really restrict our fundamental freedoms. They are adopted at night to enter into force the day after. So citizens don't understand them. We don't understand why we cannot move from the 21st of December until the 5th of January and on from the 18th of December until, I would say, the 2nd of January. So we don't understand the reason behind this. We don't understand how the government has achieved these decisions. And it's here, I think, that parliaments could really play a fundamental role in restoring the confidence of citizens in decision-making. First of all, by giving transparency. Any process of decision-making which is transparent is already a value from the perspective of the democratic legitimacy. And also, I think that elected representatives, single MPs, are better than experts in providing, in mediating a citizen interest. And this is the second point. So I will stop here.
If I can shortly just comment on that, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think something that builds at least a bit of trust is that people feel that the decisions are made close to them, because one discussion we have had in Finland from the beginning of the crisis is also that what decisions should be made on the national level and what should be made on a regional level, because at the beginning of the crisis, of course, it's hard to understand for some small business in the northern part of Finland where there were no COVID cases at all. Why should I close my cafeteria? While now we have given more and more power to the regional level, so people feel that they are closer to the decision makers who might be closing the ice hockey arena or the restaurants or making some restrictions. So that I think is also a very interesting question about decentralization of these issues. Of course, some decisions have to be made in the capitals on a national level, and sometimes it varies, but as much as possible should also be taken to the local and regional level, because I think it also strengthens the democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for interesting interventions. And I just wanted to come back on this issue of communication, really, of rebuilding trust and how parliaments and indeed political parties can do that. I think that people feel increasingly distanced maybe from the institutions that govern them, and indeed in some cases fearful and isolated, particularly during the COVID crisis. How can we rebuild that trust? Maybe we've had a question from participants on how political parties, for example, can use the media more to represent the issues that they campaign on, and that they should be representing the people on within the parliament itself. So how do we effectively communicate and increase that transparency from the parliamentary point of view?
If I can say something,
Yes, Ricky, go ahead.
We would all like to have an answer on how Parliament can restore confidence, because it's not, of course, not obvious, and even not obvious that confidence could be restored on the base of the legislature activities. instead of on the basis of public policies, for instance. But what is striking to me from a comparative observation of legislature during the crisis is that within some European democracies, the major decisions on the lockdowns, on the end of the lockdowns, on distribution of vaccines now, etc., the announcement of the government in some parliaments, in some democracies, have been made in the parliament, in front of the MPs, with the capacity of the opposition to answer. And in other democracies, most of the news were made in front of journalists during television broadcast that we all know. And well, I'm not calling for the end of television, etc. But to me, it makes a difference, you know, if the parliament is still the place where major decisions are made and publicly discussed rather early in the process, not 1 week after, not 1 month after. And I mentioned that because I think that it's a first step to be confident in institutions, to consider that they are performing an important job in society, to see as citizens that the Prime Minister is making the force of going to the Parliament and answering questions.
If I may, if I can jump in, yes, I would say where Parliament is the place where decisions should be announced or debated. But Parliament is, what I can observe at least, is also used, of course, by groups and parties which are very much opposed to whatever kind of measures, which are also questioning the existence of the virus or whatever. So you have also kind of what's happening in parliaments is also that you have this debate, which is great, which is necessary. But of course, you also give room to these positions. It's something, of course, which is part, and I mean, it's kind of the conflict between representation on the one hand and coming to decisions on the other hand. So you give room to these positions, and so that's sometimes where a lot of people are saying, well, if you go to parliament and then if things are debated there, then everyone is going to accept that. So it's just one point. You have to go to parliament. There are good reasons for going there, and that's the place to debate. But it could also, of course, create much more, let's say, an ambivalence in the perception of what's happening. It's just, I know it's critical, this remark, in some ways, because it's kind of saying, well, there's a danger of debate. But what we can see is that there are right populist parties, especially, who use this situation very much in order to get to organize those who might be the losers of the crisis. So that's what's happening right now.
Can I also jump in for a minute here?
Go ahead.
I would just say that, I mean, if you're thinking about these issues of legitimacy or transparency, you know, for a government writ large or for a parliament or the executive within that, it isn't only a matter of how effectively or transparently the government will communicate to the people. I think that the legitimacy for a lot of this will come from how effectively the people are able to communicate to the government. And that, you know, this goes back to the point that I made at the beginning about how I think that one of the most important roles for a parliament in this kind of crisis right now is to effectively represent the interests of constituents in this process of trying to work out how you can come up with a livable balance of all of the competing claims or interests that the pandemic raises. And I think that the legitimacy of that outcome is going to depend on how effectively the parliaments, the lawmakers, have done their job of speaking for the people they represent back home. It isn't just something that you can concoct out of a few press conferences or you know, having legislators who are more active on Twitter where the politician is talking down to the you know, public. Because I mean, you've seen a lot of places where you do have these regular press conferences, and if anything, it seems to hurt because people feel like they're getting these conflicting messages from their leaders that don't make an awful lot of sense, and yet the process for feeding back your dissatisfaction with those messages hasn't really caught up yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that two-way communication, that two-way access and transparency is very, very important. But it does also make me worry about, with social media and so on, the fact that the channels of communication that are uncontrollable. They're personalized, they're individual, and all the on issues of communication and transparency and indeed disinformation, that makes the issue of how parliaments operate and who they represent and what they do much more complex and difficult to follow. Listen, we're coming really to the end of the session. Time has gone incredibly quickly. I just wanted to give you all very quickly a second comment if you'd like to wrap up, and then we're going to have to quickly go to the final concluding session. So maybe if we can go in reverse order, maybe starting with Ms. Griglio. If you can if there's any final words you'd like to have before we finish.
Well, I think that there are many challenges that parliaments need to face, and the COVID emergencies will surely lead to major revisions of the rules and procedures of their internal organization. This is what I foresee for the future of parliaments. And I think that in a certain way, I have already stressed the importance of the oversight function, which should be really enhanced in the future. Parliaments will need to learn how to ask the government to give evidence, to be transparent in its decision and to take responsibility of its action. That's the added value of having communication in Parliament rather than in social media and on TV. But speaking of legislation, probably we also need to rediscover the difference between lawmaking as any form of legislation that may be adopted by any institutions and legislating, which means adopting laws in parliaments by providing every single MP, every single party the opportunity to participate. This is really an added value for democracy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Starberg?
I would just wrap up by making a plea to everyone to remember that this isn't only a political or a governance question. I think that there's a very important social aspect to this too, because certainly the policy decisions that lawmakers make regarding the pandemic, both the public health, the civil liberties issues, the economy, it's going to have a very profound impact on the way our societies are going to continue to function and the way ordinary people will relate to the people and businesses and others around them. And to my mind, that makes the work of parliaments all the more important, because the parliament is going to be the institution that will effectively be, if anyone can, it'll be the parliament that can mediate all of these competing interests and come up with some way forward for our societies that we can all work with. So I think that this is a very, very important moment for parliaments, and a lot of these decisions are too important to be left in the hands of the executive alone.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Professor Rosenberg.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say the same. I don't know if we should be optimistic or pessimistic about the development of parliament. We've seen that there are pros and cons on many aspects. We've seen also that parliaments have a great capacity of adaptation, contrary maybe to their image and contrary to the fact that they have 200 of years of existence for some of them. But what I'm sure of is that parliaments are needed. We in a time of social tension, with the economic crisis, with the digital communication, we need a place in society where people who disagree sit together and talk and don't fight, to put it simply.
Professor Marshall.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, great. Yes, what I would, my take-home message for myself is that, okay, parliaments are certainly learning institutions, but there are some risks. And to prevent the risks to be realized, I guess we have to think about vaccination also of parliaments and parliamentary democracy. So we have to think about medicine or whatever kind of support to support parliaments, especially those who are vulnerable, who are which are in systems which are perhaps not that resilient when it comes to well, the shift to executive power, etc. And so that's why, well, what we do here and this kind of exchange is so important and so valuable, and so that's why I very much appreciate this whole approach and this workshop and what you're doing in your organizations. Thank you.
Vaccination of parliaments, indeed, I like it. Mr. Strand, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller, and thank you all for this discussion. It's been very nice to meet you digitally. Maybe we meet sometime in person as well. The whole COVID crisis, of course, gives the parliaments, but also every single human being a type of timeout to stop and think what we could do better in the future on different levels. And if I would lift one thing, it's that all the recovery and resilience and money that is now spent on trying to kickstart the economy again, I hope that we will spend it in a way that we also solve other types of global crises like climate change, to develop new technologies, and that we, whatever happens, we will focus on education and innovation, because that's the most important thing for also democracies. Thank you.
Mr. Strand, I think we're going to have to move along now. Just to say, I can't do better to summarize than what you've all just said. I think for me, it's just showing that with whatever comes next, parliaments are incredibly important to that. They've shown themselves maybe more adaptable than many institutions, and they have to be central in rebuilding trust with ordinary citizens. It just remains for me to thank you all, the panelists, to thank my co-organizers, to thank all of you at home, although of course we are all at home. And now I'm going to hand over the floor to Mr. Christoph Bernacki, Head of the Capacity Building and Parliamentary Support Unit of the European Parliament, who will moderate for the last 30 minutes, the concluding session. Thank you very much, once again.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you all. We just heard a very rich debate. Good afternoon to you. First of all, I would like to warmly thank our partners in the organization of this conference, the democracy sector of DG DevCo in the European Commission and Inter Pares Parliaments in Partnership, for excellent cooperation on this project. I believe it is just the beginning of a common constructive work on innovative democracy tools for parliaments. In this work, we aim to link academic research with parliamentary practice, and this is what we have heard today. I would also like to extend my special thanks to almost 400 participants that have registered to this conference. Participants came from parliaments, both members and staff, academia, political parties, international organizations, and civil society. Many citizens interested in the future of democracy also registered and participated in this conference. This diversity shows that the alliance between policymakers, experts in parliaments, practitioners in parliamentary capacity development, and civil society has become a reality. Here I would like to highlight the participation from national parliaments. Both members and staff from 20 national parliaments of the European Union have attended our 3 sessions. Relationship with national parliaments is crucial. Together, we are now in the process of creating a hub for parliamentary support in the world. This hub is the virtual venue where EU national parliaments share their best practices and develop new innovative tools of action in order to assist parliamentary democracies in third countries. I commend the participation of parliamentarians and staff from many non-EU parliaments, especially Western Balkans, a priority region for the European Parliament, and beyond. The virtual format of this conference has made it possible for participants from the parliaments of Bolivia, Malaysia, South Sudan, and many other distant countries to be here with us. We can say that we are able to turn COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity to strengthen democracy worldwide. The ambition of this conference is to identify the most advanced innovative democratic tools. We are now more aware of the potential of these tools, which range from deliberative mini-publics to new technologies enabling parliaments to function even in time of crisis. It is now up to us, staff engaged in parliamentary capacity development under the leadership and ownership of our elected members, to implement these new tools in our daily work. I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Kevin Casa Zamora, Secretary General, International Area. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Christoph. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, partners, colleagues, and friends. Thank you so much for joining this important conference on how parliaments can adapt and innovate to remain relevant in the light of today's challenges to democracy. I am truly delighted, moreover, to share this closing session with my very distinguished colleagues and partners from the European Parliament and the European Commission. In the past 3 days, this virtual conference has tackled some of the most salient issues facing parliaments in this pivotal moment for democracy. More importantly, however, I'm glad that this event has had a forward-looking, solution-focused approach, going beyond the diagnostic in order to present good practices, innovations, and tools for parliaments, not just in the EU, but around the world. If you haven't had the chance to take part in all the sessions, I would certainly encourage you to view some of the recordings online, as there were some truly fascinating discussions on topics ranging from how parliaments can remain relevant in light of challenges posed by populism, voter alienation, declining trust and participation, technological transformation, and the distorted information and communication landscape. Or how parliaments can respond to citizens' demands for active engagement in the decision-making process, while also respecting the fundamental principles of representative democracy. And finally, how parliaments can ensure that their complex, lengthy, often cumbersome deliberation and decision-making processes outcompete the swift and simplistic methods to address the concerns of society proposed by populists of all hues. I won't be able to make to do justice to all the enlightening remarks and thought-provoking discussions held over the past few days, but I would like to highlight a few key ideas that resonate with some of the internal discussions we've been having at our institute. Nadia Urbinati, our keynote speaker and renowned scholar of representative democracy, emphasized how democracies need to become more inclusive if they are to address the challenges of authoritarian populism. Professor Urbinati also emphasized democracy's great advantage over other systems, namely its ability to constantly innovate, to reinvent itself, and meet the needs of new circumstances, new technologies, and new expectations from the population. In the session of December the 8th, we looked closely at how parliaments are innovating to enhance their engagement with citizens, not just around elections, but throughout the decision-making process. We heard, for instance, about Ireland's groundbreaking citizens' assembly model, which successfully addressed the country's most controversial subjects. We also heard from the Brussels regional initiative where citizens commissions work with elected officials to address citizens' own priorities. These are the kinds of groundbreaking examples that we need to learn from, that we need to evaluate and improve and adapt to local contexts. Stagnation and status quo are simply not an option, neither for parliaments nor for democracy writ large. Today, just before this closing session, we've heard how COVID-19 has confirmed the same, that every crisis harbors an opportunity. On the one hand, parliaments have been under extreme pressure to expand the government's powers and enable them to efficiently respond to the pandemic, which also meant limiting freedoms and restricting accountability. These measures cannot become the new norm. And Parliament's scrutinizing role is perhaps more vital now than ever before. On the other hand, the pandemic has also demonstrated Parliament's ability to innovate by using virtual means, not only to safely conduct their regular work during the pandemic, but also to open up and engage citizens in parliamentary debates. This was the case, for instance, in Brazil's Senate, which included a possibility for citizens to post their input to debates within the application that hosted the chamber's online sessions. And unlike the expansion of powers to governments, it would be good if these measures would remain in place after the health emergency has subsided, at least in some form. As an example, out of 58 parliaments that had shifted to virtual plenary sessions in the early phase of the pandemic, only 24 were still fully virtual at the beginning of this month. However, many allow some hybrid solutions so that members in high-risk groups or who have been exposed to the virus can still log in and participate virtually while their colleagues attend in person. Given what we've heard in the past few days, I am optimistic that despite current challenges, parliaments can and are reinventing themselves and will continue to play a central role in a reinvigorated democracy. A democracy that is where the gap has narrowed between electors and the elected, and dialogue between citizens and parliamentarians has been revitalized through innovations enabled by virtual platforms, participatory policymaking, and citizen assemblies. But this conference is not just a forum to share ideas and innovations. It is indeed a first step towards identifying practical opportunities for capacity development in the developing democracies where we work. International IDEA through Inter Pares will be working with the European Parliament and the European Commission to transform these opportunities into realities. We'll be organizing a working group on parliament and democratic innovation to consolidate and share the lessons learned from this event, and also to support our partner parliaments in emerging democracies to make use of these lessons as they develop and enhance their own processes. At the same time, we would also listen to their insights and experiences. Capacity building can never be a one-way street. As we know very well, that also established democracies require constant attention, protection, and improvements. There is a lot of urgent and important work to be done to make sure that democracy, and in particular representative institutions, live up to the expectations of citizens. We must get on with that work. If there's anything we know for sure is that there's nothing inevitable about the advance and sustainability of democracy. Democracy is neither created nor maintained by itself. It is something that requires continuous vigilance, dedication, and support. I certainly hope that this crisis will prompt donors and assistance providers to enhance dialogue, coordination, and cooperation to support democracy and the rule of law around the world. That's precisely what we're trying to do through Inter Pares in partnership with the European Union and with its invaluable support. There's never been a better time to join forces to build more resilient, more responsive, more vibrant democratic institutions. The very magnitude of this crisis gives us a unique chance to expand the frontiers of what's possible. Many parliaments around the world are seizing this opportunity, and all of us who care about the future of democracy must seize it too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your insightful remarks from the international idea perspective. Thank you very much. Now I would like to warmly welcome Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director General DG DevCo European Commission. Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Good afternoon to you all. And let me start by saying that I am extremely delighted to have the opportunity to make some concluding remarks at this important conference on behalf of the European Commission. First of all, my thanks to the European Parliament for hosting and to our partner on Inter Pares International IDEA. This conference could not be more timely. 2020 has been a year of enormous challenges. And it's safe to say that our societies, our democracies will never be the same again. But the real challenge now is how we will respond. Parliaments are the central institution of any democracy. They are in fact the oldest of all democratic institutions. They reflect pluralism and diversity in society. They legitimize the rule of law through their legislative function. And they are pivotal in ensuring accountability of the executive to the people. So if parliaments are crucial to democracy, so is supporting parliaments around the world an important part of EU external cooperation and of the EU's comprehensive approach towards democracy promotion. Last year, we launched at the European Parliament a new project called Inter Pares, the EU flagships project on parliamentary strengthening implemented by International IDEA. Inter Pares is unique for two main reasons. To begin with, it is the first ever EU-funded parliamentary support project with a global geographical scope. Special implementation modality, it is peer-to-peer, hence its name, Inter Pares, among peers. Our aim is to strengthen parliamentary democracy by promoting and facilitating exchanges between EU member state parliaments and partner parliaments around the world. As has already been mentioned, since the COVID-19 outbreak, we have been focusing, of course, on the health crisis and the socio-economic crisis, but of course there is a third crucial dimension: the impact of the pandemic on human rights and democracy worldwide. And unfortunately, the COVID crisis has made a bad situation worse, centralizing power and at times giving a pretext for repression. Today, an estimated 2.5 billion people live in countries where human rights and democracy are in decline. For the first time in a decade, autocracies are in the majority. 92 countries, home to 54% of the global population. Civic and political space is shrinking and more power is concentrating in fewer hands with less and less accountability. Youth, women and girls, and minorities in particular face huge challenges to have their voices heard. So a bleak picture. But what is to be done? Well, for the European Union, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are in our DNA. We work to adhere to these principles at home, but also in our work with our partners, and this work continues, supporting parliaments, amongst others. But we must also adapt. Parliaments must adapt. We must learn the lessons of the crisis and seize the opportunities. The COVID crisis has disrupted and destroyed, but this also gives us a chance to build back better. Central to this must be rebuilding trust in democracy and its institutions, making them more inclusive, more responsive, and more accountable. Fewer walls, more doors and windows. For example, digital technologies give us some tools to do this. And certainly digital technologies can empower citizens, but they can also empower autocracy and repression. So this is something which is, of course, an issue we have to be attentive to. Similarly, poverty, inequality, and injustice has spurred unprecedented levels of civic protest and political engagement, a very good thing. But if those basic questions are left unanswered, that could give rise to desperation, which could be fertile ground for populism and extremism. So we must therefore respond, helping to channel this into constructive change and giving voice to those who struggle to be heard. There are, of course, others on the scene who have a different vision, a completely different vision, and we must speak out against them and speak up for our values and defend those who do likewise. And parliaments must be central to this response. Any system of democratic governance is, of course, not perfect. It is often flawed, just like its institutions, but we have seen again and again how democratic institutions strengthen society against crisis, both natural and man-made. And the more inclusive, participatory, accountable, and transparent we make these institutions, the stronger we become, because the truth is institutions are made of people. As we conclude this conference, let me reinstate once again that the European Union will continue to stand unequivocally for democracy, rule of law, and human rights, and will continue to support parliaments around the world in times of crisis, but also in the better times that we hope will come soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seychelles. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the European Commission for the important work in support of global parliamentary democracy. Thank you very much indeed. Now I have the pleasure to welcome Pietro Ducci, the Director General for External Policy, European Parliament. Pietro, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for giving me the floor and for inviting me for this final words of conclusion of this very interesting conference. I must say that the organizer, who I'm going to thank very soon, put quite a challenge to me, because basically I have to do the conclusions of the conclusions, which is something which is really not always easy to do. So I'm not going to go towards many of the concepts which have been very well made by my previous speakers about the role of the parliaments, about the coherence of the approach in democracy support, etc., etc. But I'm going to highlight 2-3 points. First of all, thank you very much to the organizers, in particular all the colleagues from DG DEFCO, with whom it is always a pleasure to develop the parliamentary side of democracy support, which is something that we have been investing since many years together, and I'm pretty very happy about that. Thanks a lot to all the inter-pares colleagues for these tremendous efforts, for this fantastic job that they're doing to put all the relevant interlocutors around the table and to make all these people work together. I must say that I'm really been from the very beginning a very strong supporter of the inter-pares project. I remember, like it was like 5 years ago, discussions where we had preliminary discussions in the parliament. We started to organize our work around democracy support, around capacity development, and we really started to insist with the colleagues also in DGDEFCO. I remember some discussion about the importance of the parliament, and see slowly that inter pares was becoming a reality, which is now is really something that really for somebody like me who's been active in sport since 20 years, it's really a big pleasure. So I'm happy about that. So as I said, I don't want to go too much at some point, which seemed to me to deserve a little bit of importance. First of all, as you remember at the beginning of the conference, Mr. McAllister, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Democracy Support Group, was saying something quite interesting, which was that to say that democracy has continually to renew themselves, and all the intervention, all the work of the development of democracy is something which is not set on stone, it's not fixed, and it's not something that you should see to be quite strong and quite inventive in seeing how the various interlocutors are put together, the parliament, between the institution, the executive, all things that you have already been saying. And I think that Mr. McAllister was quite right in highlighting this point. I would like to welcome an idea which has been just underlined by Kevin, the idea of setting up a working group. I think this is a very good instrument. This is a very good way of giving a concrete follow-up to the conference. We are ready at the European Parliament at the administrative level, but I'm pretty sure at political level, members will appreciate that, and we're very interested in seeing the political added value of this working group in how to reform our working methods. You can count on us, and definitely you will have a lot of push, like always, on a positive side from the European Parliament. I understand that you have been talking a lot about COVID, the elephant in the room, even more than that. Look at this. I mean, we have a conference with 300 participants and nobody's in the same room for a reason we know very well, and that's been highlighted. So about COVID, let me just say that there has been a very interesting session like a month ago, where President Sassoli of the European Parliament met with the EU ambassadors of the EU delegations around the world. And indeed, they really, this is an annual gathering where we have that kind of meeting in the European Parliament. And in that occasion, the President of the European Parliament really wanted to highlight how much Parliament has been active and how much, despite the COVID, despite the difficulty, despite the challenges, democracy was still alive, and democracy is still alive. As it has been said during the conference, if some institutions have been particularly put under stress by the COVID, it is really the parliamentary institution. Some of the executive could have had the chance or the idea to strengthen their grip on the societies and to forget about civil society, forget about parliaments. But so therefore for parliament, it has really been a tremendous challenge to live with it. And it has really been something that every parliament has faced. I know that all the colleagues of national parliament have also been confronted to that. And the European Parliament, as the others, had to a little bit to reinvent its way of working. And something that was done from the very beginning, from the first confinement that was here in Brussels around February, March, from the very beginning, Parliament immediately wanted to continue with this, the European Parliament, with his plenary session, and invented a way to allow members to participate and to vote with very complicated system. Parliament continued to work to make his committee work with a complicated system of gathering, even with remote interpretation and meetings where members could still express their voices in their language. And this meeting via a system which is called Interaction has now become something which is on a day-by-day kind of work, but it has been extremely important because it has really given the possibility of the European Parliament to be present, to be a partner, to be an example in some cases, and this is something that I think was important to highlight. Also at the staff level, we have been now working, all of us, like many of you, by remote. I'm happy to see my colleague Christoph Bernaski, who is here, just made the conclusion. I haven't seen Christoph for about at least two or 3 months, and I'm happy to see him from time to time on the screen. But this is the new way of working, and we all have to adapt to that, and we've been adapting to that. And by the way, either at political level and at the administrative level for the European Parliament, we are learning lessons about what's going on. And we're really looking also, in particularly those of us who are working in the field of external relations, once the pandemic will be a bad memory, we're not there, we will not ban all this technology, new way of working, all this disadvantages, so many other will be much easier to organize in the future. And maybe there is an added value also about this fact that we're going to use more this instrument for the future. Let me just highlight on the side of the European Parliament how much the colleagues and the members of Parliament who are dealing with capacity development are really at the heart of this kind of developments. I mean, some of you, I think you have heard during the conference, but you know that in the European Parliament, there is a political body who's called the Democracy Support and Election Coordination Group, which is the political body who has the responsibility to develop and to propose all activities in the field of democracy support. There are many activities, from election observation to human rights activities with civil societies, some activities in the field of mediation, investment with young political leaders, but there is also a very important activity, which is at the core of the conference in these days, which is the capacity developments. The capacity development is something on which Parliament has insisted a lot, because from the start of this new legislature, it has really decided that the European Parliament was about to become for all our partners, first of all, but also for the other institutions and for international organizations. The fact that this Parliament wants to see a bit element of all the capacity and propose them that they are the best, and we want to show the model that the European Parliament has developed. On the contrary, the idea behind the philosophy behind the whole activities of capacity development is that the Parliament is a partner and approaches the other in a humble way. There is never going to be, from the side of the European Parliament, the approach of saying this is the way things should be done, take it or leave it. On the contrary, in all the relations with parliaments of third countries with whom the European Parliament develops its relation, there is always a dialogue, whether we should develop more, some kind of activities than others, and there is a strong commitment and will from the third country to develop and to engage with the European Parliament in this respect. This brings me to the final word, which is maybe, according to me, the most important, that all this cannot be done in isolation. No institution, whether there is a parliament, whether an executive, whether an international organization, can think that it is a champion of democracy support or of parliamentary capacity building or development. Can do that all alone. On the contrary, the tremendous added value of working together. First of all, homework in the EU, us, European Parliament, with the European Commission, with the colleague of DG DEFCO, with the colleague of the External Action Service, with the colleague in the EU delegation around the world, and all the international organizations working on that. But also, and this is for me extremely important, with all the colleagues of the national parliament of EU member states, who are doing very similar and sometimes extremely interesting activities in the field of democracy support. And the real key added value is that in the future, we're going to continue to work all together. That will be for me the recipe for a good development and a continuous development and novel kind of approach, innovative kind of approach, as McAllister was saying at the beginning, in order to reinvent democracy. And I really look forward in the next months to continue working with all of you. And I am very happy to having had the chance to participate. And thank you very much for this very interesting conference. Thank you very much.
Pietro, thank you very much for your words, and I would like to thank you for your continuous support for our work in the field of democracy development. And you mentioned President Sassoli. I would like now to recall his words. He recently said that democracy never stops. And this is exactly what we will be doing. It is now time to close the conference, but we will not stop here. We will continue our work on democracy, innovative democracy tools and parliaments. We will continue, and rest assured that we will work in this working group and share with you the results of our work. I would like finally to say thank you to all participants, speakers, panelists, moderators for their participation, and I'm looking forward to see you at the next conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.